All right, today we're going to learn how to write out our decimal numbers, how to say them out loud, and how to write them down so that we can translate between English and our numbers. It's really important to be able to communicate our numbers to one another. So we have to know our decimal place values in order to be able to read and write and say our decimal numbers properly. Some people do tend to get lazy and say things like 8.2 or 8.25. As you get older, yes, sometimes it is quicker to say your numbers that way. Many people do say it that way, but we're gonna this year make sure that we are saying it like true mathematicians, because we need to learn the proper way to say it and communicate our numbers to one another. So let's go ahead and start with our whole numbers. So again, our whole numbers are to the left of our decimal point. So let's work our way out. So we have our ones, our tens, hundreds. Now it would continue going, but you guys already know that. You've mastered that. Oops, and sorry, I meant to show you that. When we get to the decimal point, this is super duper important. When we get to the decimal point, you will pronounce your decimal by using the word and. You will not say point, you will say and we'll learn the proper way to then pronounce our decimal place values. So let's go ahead and work our way out. Please, please, please remember there is no such thing as oneths. We made a really big deal about that in class, and it's because it's true, and so many kids forget that. They think that it's a perfect mirror image of their whole place value, so they think, oh, it starts with oneths. Wrong. It does not start with oneths. We start with tenths. And then from that point on, it is a mirror image of what's happening with our whole place values. So after tenths, we have hundredths, then thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and then millionths. Now this would continue on, and we would have 10 millionths, 100 millionths, billionths, but we're not really going to be going out that far, quite that far. And if we want to go ahead and label just for consistency, these are our decimal place values. Okay, this is really, really important, because when we are reading and writing our decimal numbers, we have to know what our decimal place values are. So let's go ahead and walk through this process. When we're reading and saying our decimal numbers, we're going to start with our whole numbers first. We're going to start with what we're already familiar with. I guess I should stay consistent with my colors. We're going to work with our whole numbers first. So we're going to read from the left to the right. So we're going to say our whole numbers like we normally do. Then we're going to work our way over into our decimal numbers. So we read from left to right just like we do when we're reading a book, just like we do normally. When you get to the decimal point, you say the word and. That's super important. Do not say the word point, say the word and. Then we're going to ignore everything in front of the decimal. So ignore all of those numbers that you already took care of. Say the numbers behind the decimal just like you would say a whole number. So that may feel a little bit weird, but we're going to do a lot of examples, so hopefully it will start to feel more comfortable. So you're going to go ahead and cover everything else up. So you're going to cover everything up except for the numbers behind the decimal, and you'd say it like a whole number. Then the last thing we need to do is say the place value, where the last digit falls. So let's do some examples together to help all of that make sense. So if I have 5.9, 0.9, that's not how we're going to pronounce that as a mathematician. As a mathematician, we would read this as 5, and when you get to the decimal point, you say and. Then we're going to cover everything up, and we're just going to look at what's behind the decimal. That's the number 9, and the 9 is sitting 9 in the tenths place value. 5 and 9 tenths. Okay, let's do another example. So I say my whole numbers normally, 32 and Now let's ignore everything except for what's behind the decimal. So if I look at just that number, I'd say 82. That's 82. And that is part of your number. So it's 32 and 82. And then the last step is you have to figure out what place value is that 2 sitting in. That 2 is in our tenths, hundredths place value. Let's look at another example together. Let's add this down. 403, so that's just 403. Let's write that out. 403. Got to my decimal point. And let's ignore everything in front of the decimal and let's look at just what's behind the decimal. If I said that as a whole number, I would say 573. So go ahead and write that down. That's 573. And our last step is to figure out what place value is that last digit sitting in. That 3 is in our tenths, hundredths, thousandths place value. If you leave this off, if you leave this place value off, your number will not make any sense. People will think it's 2 whole numbers, I guess, added together. Nobody's going to understand what you're talking about. If you're talking about a decimal number, you have to tell us what decimal number it is by naming your place value. Let's look at a more complicated example. So this is 7,380. When you get to the decimal, you say and. Okay, now we're going to ignore everything in front of the decimal, and let's look at just what's behind the decimal. If I ignore everything else, and I just look at that, I see 95. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. 95. And our last step is to figure out what place value that's in. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Be sure to tune into the next video for the backside of the notes.